Today's daf we're going to be learning is Avodah Zarah Daf Nun Chet. We started yesterday with the story of an idol worshiper comes into a store, wants to buy wine. There's people in the store say, "Sorry, we don't sell wine." The idol worshiper sees a pail full of wine, touches it, puts his hand in, says, "What? Isn't this wine?" And the Jew gets so angry. Store owner takes the pail, dumps all the wine from the pail into his barrel, thus messing up his barrel, creating a tarovet, a mixture of yenesech with the wine. So we ended up with this big debate. Rava says, "Oh, it's no problem. He can sell it to idol worshippers, right?" Shari Rava the Zibune Lovdei Kovim. He says, "Oh, you can sell that barrel to idol worshippers. Don't worry, you can benefit from it." Why? Because the assumption is the Gentile was had a purpose, put his hands in the wine specifically to check if it was wine, not to offer it up as a libation, and therefore we can assume it's not wasn't used as Yenesach. But Rav Huna, Rav Huna Bar Nachman said, "No way, no how." And they'll go out with their shofarot and announce to everybody that their psak is the right one. Now the story continues at the top of our page. Ikla Rav Huna, this seemed to happen, okay, Rashi says, sometime down the road. Okay, now Rava permitted, I want to remind you, and Rav Huna Bar Chinina, Rav Huna Bar Rav Nachman said no way. I want to remind you that Rav Nachman was the main rabbi of Rava, okay, and yet his son is ending up in this debate with Rava. So according to the version of the text we have, and I will point out there's other versions, you'll see the story is a little strange, and you can see why it leads to other versions. Ikla Rav Huna bered Rav Nachman leMachosa. So Rav Huna, the son of Rav Nachman, comes to Machosa, which is Rava's city. Rav is the Rav in Machosa. Amar Rava Rav Eliakim Shamei. So Rava says to Rav Eliakim Shamash, Trok trok gale de lo nete inashe dinitrit. Close and lock the door, and don't let anybody in. I don't want anybody to bother me. Now, either he wanted to avoid Rav Huna bar Rav Nachman and said, "I don't want him coming in here. Make sure he doesn't come in." And then al legabe, he goes in anyway. So it's a little bit strange. He goes in, but he told him, "Don't let anybody in." Maybe he thought, "Don't let anybody in," but not important people like Rav Huna, the son of Rav Nachman. Or perhaps he meant, "Don't let anyone in other than him." In other words, when I'm meeting with him, don't let anybody else in. I don't want to be disturbed. Some people actually have the nusach that was Rav Nachman, his father. It wasn't Rav Huna bar Rav Nachman who disagreed with Rav. It was actually Rav Huna's father who was Rav's Rav. And then maybe again, it would be strange if he was saying, "Don't let him in." Probably he was saying, "Don't let anyone else in" while he's there. It's very unclear. Okay, but let's go with the simple reading, even though it's a bit of a difficult reading, that he was trying to avoid Rav Huna bar Rav Nachman and said, "Lock the door, don't let anyone in," but then somehow he let him in anyway. Amar le ki agavna mai. So then he says, what would be the situation in a case like this, like the one we had with the idol worshiper? Amar le asur afilu bahana'a. So Rava answers, it's forbidden to benefit from. Now Rava it's not what Rava said on the previous page. And it seems strange that he said this, although some of the commentaries explain Rava had changed his mind, and that's why he said this. And we're going to see Rava changes his mind from later on. So we'll talk about that. But right now, Rava says it's forbidden even to benefit, meaning you can't sell it. So now comes again, let's assume Rav Huna bar Rav Nachman, who says, "V'hamaru damar shechshech eno seoto yenesach." But eno se yenesach, you're the one who said if the idol worshiper puts his hands in there specifically to check it out and not to do a libation, then we assume that he wasn't doing a libation at the same time, and it's permitted. Well, comes Rav and he answers, yeah, according to what we explained and according to what some of the commentaries go by, Rav had changed his mind, and that's why he said this. And the answer should have been, "Oh, I changed my mind." But Rav doesn't say that. And some of the commentaries think he wasn't willing to admit he was wrong, even though he admits in other places he's wrong. So it's a little bit difficult, which is why there's different interpretations here. But let's just assume he doesn't really want to admit he's wrong. And as I'm saying, assume because there's so many different ways to read this story that it's hard to explain it in a Daf Yomi class without getting into all the different, right? I'm trying to just explain it one simple way, even though I have a hard time feeling like I'm being intellectually honest if I'm not telling you that there's different ways to interpret this. So now he says, "V'hamaru imar da'amre ana levar midmei da'u chamra." Wait, when I said the person could sell it, remember he said Shari Rav Elizabun Elevei Kochavim, said you could take the barrel and sell that barrel that now has Yei Nesach dumped into it. Right, the rest of it was fine, but the Yei Nesach messes up the whole thing. Rava said you could sell it anyway. So now comes Rava, and again, maybe he was being honest. We don't know. According to some, he was actually twisting the truth. So, when I said that, I meant levar midemeo da'u chamra. Obviously, what I meant is if you had, let's say, 10 liters of wine in there, and 1 liter was the wine that was dumped from the pail, and the other 9 liters were fine wine. What I meant is sell the 10-liter barrel to an idol worshiper for the price of 9 liters. I never said that you could benefit from that wine that's definitely Yei Netzach. We knew there was a liter of problematic wine. On that, you can't make money. And that's so I do agree that it's forbidden to benefit from. It's just once it got into a mixture, I allowed him to sell the rest of the barrel. But I wouldn't have allowed him to sell the mixture by itself, the Yei Netzach by itself. And when it's mixed in, even then, you have to deduct that amount. Okay, right? So demeu chamra miyamre. I definitely didn't say that you could sell the amount of that wine. Now, it definitely didn't sound like that's what Rava said on the previous page, but that's what Rava is explaining now to explain himself. So I'm a Rava. Now we have a different scene. And one of the issues Tosfot has with this reading is if Rava really changed his mind at that point, and then number one, why didn't he admit he was wrong? Rava does that. And number two, the Sukkah should have brought the part about Rava changing his mind first and then brought this story. So there's a bunch of weaknesses with this version. I'm a Rava. Ki ata the Pumbedita. Rava says when he got to Pumbedita, at panachmani shmatata umaniata da'asir. So when I got to Pumbedita and I saw Abaye, okay, I'll use this as an opportunity to talk about Rabbeinu Lau's book Chachamim, Volume 6, that came out recently, that I actually wrote the introduction to. I mentioned it before in class. One of the most interesting things I read in that book is that Rava and Abaye did not write. It's a book that goes through, it's not yet translated to English, but God willing, it will be soon. It's he talks about the lives of the rabbis, their approaches, the difference in their approaches, and two of the main characters to take up a big chunk of the book are Rav and Abaye. And we always think of Rav and Abaye as arguing with each other all the time, and they must have been, friends and in the same area. He says, no, it's not true. There's very few times in the Gemara where you actually see them, they were together. Here's one of them, okay? Because what happens is, Rava says, I got to Pumbedita, which was Abaye's city, and Nachmani and came Nachmani, which was another word for Abaye. He was adopted by, his father was Nachmani, he was adopted by his uncle, Rabban Bar Nachmani. And he starts throwing at him a shmatata, a limud of someone, statement, and a braita. And right to us here that they all said it's forbidden. And he starts attacking him with questions. So let's see what happens. So, and Rava, by the way, was in Mechoza, which we talked about. Another thing that Rabbanit talks about in the book is that the difference between Mechoza and Pumbedita. Pumbedita was a small town. Everything revolved around the Beit Midrash, as opposed to Mechoza, which was a big city, where there happened to be a Beit Midrash of Rava, but it was a big city. There's another difference between them. So anyway, he says here, Abai attacks him with shmatata, tayuvada, and what's the shmatata, the limud, that there was a case, Tahava ben Hardea, Asher Shmuel. There was a case in Tveria that happened. Shmuel forbade. And there was a case in Hardea, and Shmuel forbade. But Tveria of Asher Rabbi Yochanan, each of them forbade this in their city. And they said it's because the people there are not B'nai Torah. So maybe we can make this distinction theoretically between putting your hands in for a particular purpose, not for linasech, and say, oh, obviously then they weren't menasech, but not to people who aren't B'nai Torah, because they'll get confused and they'll say, oh, anytime an idol worshiper puts their hands in my wine, it's fine. The Amarli, Tiverio Naharde Ainam B'nai Torah, to Mechoza B'nai Torah. And then he said to me, in other words, Rav is telling this story. After Abai quotes it, he says to me, what, you think Tveria and Hardea, they didn't have B'nai Torah, and Mechoza does have B'nai Torah? In other words, your city is full of people that aren't B'nai Torah either. So if that's the way Shmuel acted and Rabbi Yochanan acted in their cities, where there weren't enough Torah people there, and they were worried that people were going to misunderstand, so how are you poskening like this for your city when they're also not all B'nai Torah? Okay, that's question number one. Rav explains that I attacked him with. Question number two, Maniata from a Braita. So there was a guy who was an inspector, that's the Argadam, the inspector of the Ovei Kochavim, who came around. He wanted to check the wine. And what did he do? Right, they say, right, what was the issue? They wanted to, right, Rashi says, right, they were checking, I guess, that they're doing their measurements right and that the wine is not spoiled. It was like an inspector that comes around like the health ministry. So what did he do? He made a hole in the top of the barrel, drilled a hole, and then he put like a straw type thing in, and he tasted some of the wine to test it to make sure it was up to the standard. Or he took a little in a cup and then dumped it back in. So either which way, when you take a straw, we always know some of it goes back in, right? Some of it went, the heat pulled up, then went back down, or some of the heat poured into the cup went back down. And there was a case like this, according to this Braita, and they forbade it. So my lab bahana'ah, do we not assume this means bahana'ah? To which Rabbi answers, lo b'shtia. No. That was just forbidden to drink. No one said it was forbidden to benefit from, and that would prove my point. Ihachi, but Abai says, no way, you can't read the Braita that way, because litni yimachel, it should have said, if it was permitted to benefit from it, would have said, then you can sell it. And how do I know it should have said that? Because the end of that Braita uses that term in a different case. And therefore, the fact that it doesn't say yimacher or sell it and it just says forbidden doesn't mean it's only forbidden to drink, but you can benefit. It must mean you can't benefit at all. And then that would go against you, Rava, who claimed that he was allowed to sell it to a non-Jew. So anyway, let's read the Sefer and we'll see where they use the term yimacher. The Sefer is just the latter part of that Braita. Charam ovei kochavim. This is a confiscator who's an idol worshiper. Shoshit yado lechavit. He put his hand into the barrel. V'kasavul shel shemen. He thought it was oil. He was checking, but nimtzeit shel yain. It turned out it was wine. So he for sure didn't do a libation here because he didn't even think it was wine. Now in that case, they said you could sell it because we're going to forbid it for drinking. We're going to be strict about drinking, but we will permit it to be sold. The fact that there it says yimacher and the previous doesn't say yimacher, it must mean it's forbidden even to benefit. And in fact, tiyufta derav tiyufta, and this is a knockout for Rava's opinion. And that's why they assume the commentaries that Rava must have changed his mind, because Rava was telling the story that Nachman, he came and attacked me with all these questions, and he must have been saying, and I changed my mind. Rabbi Yochanan ben Arza, Rabbi Yossi ben Nehorai, Havayatve v'kashatu chamra. So these two rabbis are sitting drinking wine. Ateu Gavra, a man comes over to them. Amrule ta eshkinan. Can you pour us some wine, like the bartender? Okay, they thought he was Jewish. Turns out he wasn't Jewish. Now, lebatar derama lakase, after he poured the wine into the cup, igali milta dove kochavemu. They realized, oh my God, that was a non-Jew. What did we just do? Now we're in trouble. The idol worshiper just poured our wine. Well, Chad Asar, now these are two rabbis sitting there so trying to figure out what to do. Chad Asar afilu b'hana'ah, v'chad shari afilu b'shtiyah. They each took an extreme position. One said, even to benefit from, we can't even sell this wine. And the other said, we could even drink it. It must have been really interested in drinking the wine. Anyway, let's see what his reason is. Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Manda Aser Shapir Aser, Manda Shari Shapir Shari. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, okay, it wasn't just trying to drink the wine, but the one who forbade it, he was right. And the one who permitted it was also right. In other words, they each had a legitimate argument. Doesn't mean, right, can't both be right, but they each had a good logic. Okay, turning now to Amabed. Manda Aser, the one who forbade, Memar Amar, Salke, he could say the following. Sal kadate de Rabbanan, ki hane shichra kashatu, elavadai, hai chamru v'naschei. Okay, so now the guy would say, meaning they want to know what's going through the mind of this idol worshiper when he is asked by two Jews to pour him wine. So he says, these two rabbis are sitting around drinking. They must be drinking wine. They must not be drinking beer. Okay, now we're going to assume that he didn't know what they were drinking. Okay, we're going to get back to that. The Gemara is going to ask, what do you mean? Why didn't he just see? But right now, we're going to assume he didn't know. Was it beer or wine? So the first opinion says he definitely figured these two rabbis are sitting here. For sure, they're drinking wine. And therefore, nasche, and therefore he probably offered as a libation to his God. Man share shapir shari. Now the one who permitted, and that's why he forbade. It's obviously ayin esech to the extreme. No, right? It's clearly ayin esech, which means no drinking, no benefiting. Man share shapir shari, but the one who permits also had good logic for permitting. Memar amar sagadat after Rabbanan kihane chamar kashatu. So now he says to himself, you think these rabbis were drinking wine and said to me, go pour? They know I'm a Gentile. They must be drinking beer because there's no way they would have asked this idol-worshipping Gentile to pour their wine. So it must be beer. Now, if he thinks it's beer, he's obviously now offering up as a libation, and therefore he obviously didn't offer it up. To which the Gemara says, but couldn't the guy just look and see? Was it wine? Was it beer? Bilelia, it was at night. Well, he could smell it even if he can't see it. Right? Remember, in those days, night was dark, but at least you can smell. It must have been new wine, which doesn't have a smell. But didn't he touch it by pouring it? But once he touches it, then already forget about whether he offered as a libation. We're strict about maga of a Gentile touching and ove kochavim, an idol worshiper touching, even without intent to do a libation. We still forbid it. So this doesn't make sense. To which the answer, lo tzricha de kamorek oruke, v'havele kocho shelo b'chavana. We're going to assume he didn't touch it. He just poured it, right? He basically emptied out what was in there. He didn't touch it. He didn't put anything inside it. Like it's not like he took a ladle and ladled it out. No, he just dumped it. Now, dumping is a little bit different. That's called kocho. Now, it's true. Without him dumping it, it wouldn't have been poured. So the action was done from his strength, from his action. However, kocho shelo b'chavana, the rabbis didn't forbid. Okay, they said we're not going to forbid if someone dumps something without actually coming in contact with the wine, not physically or not putting a utensil into the wine, but just by dumping, a jug full of wine, that we're not going to forbid. And that's why we could explain in the end, he didn't know it was wine. We assume he had no intent to offer it as a libation. Again, this is the one who permits. And he didn't really come in contact with it because it was kocho shelo b'chavana. Rabbi Asi me Rabbi Yochanan. And here already talking about this kocho shelo b'chavana. Now we're going to talk about something a little different, but similar. Rabbi Asi asked Rabbi Yochanan, Yain shemisacho ovei kochavei mahu. Wine that was diluted by an idol worshiper, what's the status? Now, what does it mean diluted by an idol worshiper? Well, there was wine in a cup, the concentrate, and an idol worshiper came and poured water into it. Now, this is even less because they're not even coming in contact with the wine. They're just pouring the water into the wine. Amar lei. So the first response of Rabbi Yochanan is, why do you use the language mascho? Ema mazgo. Why don't you use the typical word we use? Whenever we talk about diluted wine, we use the ayin mazug. Why don't you say mazgo? He diluted it. Amar le, ana k'tichtiv kamina. So Rabbi Asi said, I'd like to use the Tanakh language. Tivcha mascha yena. Okay, there's a pasuk in, I think it's in Mishlei, it's a pasuk in Mishlei, and it's basically talking about the diluting the wine, and it says mascha yena. They diluted the wine. Amar le, lashon Torah la'atzma, lashon chachamim la'atzma. So Rabbi Yochanan says, listen, there's Lashon Torah, there's Lashon Chachamim. They're not the same. Okay, I actually took a course in university. One was on biblical Hebrew, and one was about the language of Chachamim. How the language of Chachamim is a totally different language, right? It's not the same thing. So, actually, the whole course wasn't on Lashon Chachamim, but we did talk in my Babylonian Aramaic, Aramit Bavlit. We talked about Lashon Chachamim and how the language of Chachamim is different from the language of the Torah. So anyway, comes Rabbi Yochanan, he says, listen, these are different words in different times. And, already in the time of the Chachamim, they didn't call it mascho. And therefore, you shouldn't use that language because it just confuses people. Like, people are not going to know what mascho is. Don't try to, be high and mighty and use your Tanakh language. Stick with the people, use the language that we use nowadays. So in any case, that was a total sidetrack from the question. Question is, if you pour water into the wine, if the idol worshiper does it, it doesn't mess up the wine. Amarle, so what's the case? What's the situation? So Rabbi Yochanan answers, Amarle asul, mishum, lech amrina nazira, schor chor lekamar tikav. This is a very famous line. We say to the Nazir, keep far away from the vineyard. Go a different way. Don't walk through the vineyard where you might be tempted to drink the wine or eat the grapes. You're not allowed. Stay far away. So same thing. Don't go near this because if you let them pour the water into the wine, you might let them pour the wine into the water. Rabbi Yirmiyah ikla l'savta. Rabbi Yirmiyah comes to a place called Savta. Chaza chamra demazge ovdei kochavim v'ishte Yisrael minei. And he sees exactly this situation, that the idol worshiper is pouring the water into the wine and the Jew is drinking it. Va'asr lehu. And he said, stop what you're doing. This is forbidden. Mishum lech amrina nazira schor lekarma lo tikah. You should stay away from this because it's just going to lead to problems. Eat Marnami, it was also said on Rabbi Yochanan, Ba'amri Lam Rabbi Asi Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So it was also said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, or Rabbi Asi quoted Rabbi Yochanan, Yain Shemas Go of Kochavim Asul Mishum Lech Lech Amrin and Ziras Horse for the Kamalot Krav. Now we already know he said this because we saw it in the Gemara before, but instead of having it as a question and then the answer, some people say that he was just quoted as having said it. Rish Lakish Ikla Labatzra. So Rish Lakish comes to Batra. Chaz Yisrael. The reason this story is brought, we're going to see, is because just like Rabbi Yirmiyah had criticisms for the people before him, for the people he saw doing things, Rish Lakish also is going to have criticisms, but different ones. So the first is Chaz Yisrael Dika'achle Peri de lo Masrei. He sees a Jew eating produce that he hadn't tithed. Va'asr. And Rish Lakish says, this is forbidden. You can't eat that without tithing it. Then he saw Chazamaya Veshatu Yisrael. He saw water that an idol worshiper had prayed to, and then the Jew was drinking the water. And he said, Asarlu, no way, no how. It's idol worship. You're benefiting from idol worship, from an idol. Until the Kamei Rabbi Yochanan. And then Rish Lakish went home, went to the Beit Midrash, came before Rabbi Yochanan. I guess he told him what he did. Amarle, while your clothes are still on, turn around and go back. Like, don't take your jacket off. Go. Lav Betzer, Lav Hainu Batzra. Betzer and Batzra are two different cities. Betzer is the city, that's one of the refuge cities. That's the city that's considered in Israel proper. But Batzra is not considered the borders of Israel for the purposes of tithing produce. Right? There was areas that were conquered later, and those are not part of the original borders. Umayim shalabim ein and water that belongs to the public is not forbidden, even if people worship it as idols. And Rabbi Yochanan the Tameh, we'll just finish with this next line. To Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yotzadak, Mayim shalabim ein and this goes perfectly with what Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yotzadak. The public water that belongs to the public, it's used in wells, other things, is not forbidden. We're going to have a whole question about this. Isn't water not forbidden because it's attached to the ground? We'll get back to that in tomorrow's stuff. Okay, so what did we do? We talked today we finished that story with the Gentile putting his hands in and having a different intent. And how do we view that? And we see that Rava, who permitted it to be sold, in the end, basically doesn't permit it at all. He only said that once it gets into a mixture, well, then you can at least sell the whole barrel and minus the amount of the contents. And we had that whole weird story that was hard to understand exactly what the version was of it. Then we saw why he changed his mind, because Abaye brought two difficulties, one on Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan's ruling, and one based on Abraita's ruling. And then we had these two rabbis who were sitting and drinking wine, and they asked by accident, not realizing it was an idol worshiper, asked him to pour the wine, and they each had two opposite approaches about what the situation is, right? Did the person think it was wine and therefore offer it as a libation, or did the person think, no way are they asking me to pour them wine? It must have been beer and therefore not offer a libation, therefore it's completely permitted. And then we had to explain, well, if he touched it, wouldn't that be a problem? And they would say, if he's not really touching it directly, just pouring, it's really not a problem. And from there, we got into this Rabbi Yirmiyah, who saw someone, and or actually before that, we got into the question. Rabbi Yassi asked Rabbi Yochanan, what about pouring water into wine to dilute it? Is that a problem? And then Rabbi Yochanan said, actually, you should avoid it because just stay away from these things. And then we had the story with Rabbi Yirmiyah, who reprimanded someone who was doing that. And we ended with Rish Lakish's story, which we're going to have to continue tomorrow, who reprimanded these two people. And then Rabbi Yochanan said, you were actually wrong about that. And finish up tomorrow with that story. Wishing everyone Shabbat Shalom.